I'm Abby Wood, and I'll moderate the discussion today. I'm an associate professor of law, political science, and public policy. I'm also a fellow at the Bedrosian Center. My research is on campaign finance, mostly disclosure-related stuff, also congressional oversight of the bureaucracy and transparency. So I was very excited to be asked to participate today. I'm pleased to welcome you all to our town hall discussion with former Congressmen David Jolly and Patrick Murphy, both from Florida. Congressman David Jolly, this is the order I've got them in, so, okay. Served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2014 to 2017, representing Florida's 13th congressional district. So this is a California crowd. Where's Florida 13, right? It's probably helpful to tell you that the district includes St. Petersburg, Clearwater, and the surrounding beaches. Prior to his election, he worked for several years as a lobbyist, and today he can be seen as an analyst on CNN and MSNBC, and is a regular contributor to a number of popular political talk shows. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
And Congressman Patrick Murphy represented Florida's 18th congressional district, covering the Treasure Coast and northern Palm Beach County from 2013 to 2017. Similar time period, right? Prior to office, he was a CPA and businessman, and when elected, he was one of the first millennials elected to Congress. After leaving office in 2017, Patrick was selected to be a visiting fellow at the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service, and in 2018, he became a senior fellow at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Welcome, Patrick. So Patrick, would you like to set up the discussion today on why gridlock is a problem in Washington?
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you for hosting this. Thank you to USC and for all of you for being here on a Monday morning. That's awesome. Most of these events end up being in the evening, so it's cool you all made it. And I'm glad you pointed out that I'm a millennial there. Last night we were at dinner with some folks we just met, and I was sitting next to somebody, and somehow age came up, and she thought I was 48 years old. I was like, oh no, gosh, wait a minute. I'm supposed to be this millennial and Congress is supposed to be young, and it didn't qualify. So anyway.
Tell us more about your dinner last night.
Oh, David, yeah. we were at this event, this group called Politicon. Did you guys see that? It was really, did anybody go to that, the Politicon? No, you did, okay. It was fun, it was interesting, a lot about politics. We'll get into that because some of the panels we were on were very interesting. But Dave and I kind of started this off very casually. It was very informal. We were elected and in Congress, served together, and we agreed on a lot of the issues there. And we had some very similar experiences. So when we left the Congress, well, I guess we left. We lost our elections. A better way to say that, more accurate way. We did an interview and we were asked, what's wrong with Congress? Well, why can't you guys get anything done? Are you dumb? You're lazy? What is the deal? And we said, maybe there's a little bit of that up there, but we believe there are certain structural problems that are ripping us apart and actually incentivizing this partisan behavior. And there's no incentives, actually, basically, to go to the middle and find some common ground. So imagine you're, however old. I was 29 when I got elected to Congress, and I'm naive. I'm going to change the world. I'm going to rewrite the tax code and save the environment, and all these things I cared about. And I get elected, and right off the bat, they say, well, Patrick, look, you're a Democrat. We're going to put you over here with all the Democrats. And David, you're a Republican. You go here to this room. And right off the bat, you kind of get separated from the other side. So that's kind of crazy. So end up meeting a freshman Republican member of Congress, and we go to dinner one night, and we realized that we actually agreed on a lot of issues. So why are they separating us? This is crazy. So what we did, we started this little group called United Solutions. And we put forward some legislation that identified about $350, $400 billion of wasteful, duplicative, fraudulent spending, right? Common sense stuff. So we get Republicans and Democrats, everyone to sign up. Hey, let's go do something right off the bat that we agree on. And if we can work on the easy issues, then maybe we can build some momentum to the tougher issues. And we're getting ready to drop this legislation. And the individual I was working with, this freshman Republican, comes to me and says, Patrick, look, I'm going to need a couple more weeks before we do this. Something came up. Okay, fine, no problem. We'll give it a couple weeks and we'll go do this legislation. Well, anyway, about 6 weeks went by, and I hadn't heard from him and been dodging me. And I see him out one evening. I'm like, hey, what's the deal? Why aren't we doing this legislation? This is common sense stuff, right? We should all agree on this. Patrick, here's the deal. Speaker Boehner found out, he was the speaker at the time, found out that I was working with you on this bill. Well, he really wants to beat you in your next election in 2 years from now. And if I work with you on this, you're going to get a good headline back home. Patrick Murphy cuts wasteful spending. So I'm sorry, if I do it with you, I'm going to be dropped from my committee, and I'm not going to be able to do any fundraising with leadership. So Patrick, I'm really sorry. Maybe if you're here in forward of 5 years, maybe we can do it then. And I just said, holy cow, this is a common sense bill to cut government wasteful spending, and I can't even get someone to work with on the other side of the aisle. And that was like the wake-up call to me early on that there's a problem in this place. If right off the bat, that's what we're seeing. And I don't say that story in the beginning to be partisan, because the Democrats did the same exact thing to him on legislation that was arguably more important in this day and age. And maybe he'll talk about that eventually. But both parties are playing this game because of some of the structural problems that hopefully we'll get into here. But kind of starts off with the gerrymandering, right? The money, the media, the lack of relationships between the members of Congress, and a few other issues that get in depth. But anyway, we look forward to your questions, and thank you again for doing this.
You want to tell us about it, David?
Sure. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. When I first got into politics, similar story. I had worked with Congress and on Capitol Hill for about 20 years. That had just about every job, but I had never actually run for office. I was a first-time candidate, and I brought a healthy dose of naivety and optimism and a kind of Pollyanna spirit. When I first entered the race, I was polling at 1.5%. And the margin of error was 4. So do the math. But I was convinced, that we do have this very ideal system in many ways of citizens who make the case to their neighbors that I'd like the opportunity to give voice to your interest in our democracy. And fundamentally, I still believe that today with deep conviction. But what you do realize when you get to Congress, when Patrick said the questions we all have, why can't they get along? Why can't they work together? The reality is, particularly in the modern political era, through deliberate actions of party leaders on both sides of the aisle, but in the last 20 to 30 years, as Republicans have been in the majority in Congress more and have controlled state capitals more, much of these systemic issues have been injected by my side of the aisle. And these structural challenges impact decision-making of legislators. And so one of the things we talk about...
Your former side of the aisle.
Former side of the aisle, right.
Of the aisle, yeah.
Look, one of the things we talk about is we're not trying to beat up the current colleagues or members of Congress. We're trying to suggest how do you pull the curtain back and begin to see what incentivizes partisanship compared to what incentivizes bipartisanship. And we looked at some very basic structural issues. Gerrymandering being the primary one, that you have 90% of your seats that are supermajority for one party or the other. Your pathway to re-election is simply by being a good partisan. The moment you begin to compromise, you begin to fail that strict partisanship test, and your political future comes in doubt a little bit back home. States that have closed primary systems, it has a very similar impact on decision-making as gerrymandering. If the only votes you compete for are those within your own party, it naturally is going to be a forcing function towards partisanship, not towards bipartisanship. Campaign finance, whatever your thoughts on today's system or the solutions, we have the worst campaign finance system in the modern world. No question about it. Its ability to infect decision-making on members of Congress is significant and a significant hurdle to a pure form of decision-making. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is the ability for members of Congress to be rewarded for a behavior that's not currently rewarded. How do we unrig the system in a way that if you see members of Congress work together, there is a more viable pathway towards re-election, towards political success? Because at the end of the day, whatever line of work you're in, you're going to behave in a way that your decisions are affirmed and you ultimately get to keep your job. And the good news with all of these structural challenges we face, many of them are being addressed by voters at the state level. We're seeing campaigns to roll back gerrymandering, and we're seeing some very effectively. We're seeing campaigns to roll back a primary system. The reality is, despite Citizens United, which would require revisitation by the Supreme Court. There are campaign finance reforms that can be implemented right now, even within the framework of Citizens United, if there is sufficient demand for those changes. The final piece I'd leave you with in the opening is this. Patrick and I often get branded as moderates. Some would say, I'm a crazy right-winger, he's a crazy left-winger. Others would say, I'm a rhino who's too progressive and this guy's too conservative to be a Democrat. The labels are the labels, but the reality is we often get labeled as moderates. What I would ask you to think about, and if you leave with one thing, it's this. What we are talking about today is bipartisanship. Bipartisanship is different than adopting an ideology where you have to be moderate. What we're talking about is how can we create a playing field, a platform, where all voices have a home, from the left to the right to the center. Being moderate is a choice of ideology. God bless you if you're moderate, conservative, progressive. You should pursue that personal political interest. But how can we together create a platform where we get rewarded for progressives, moderates, and conservatives finding a path forward? That's really what we're talking about. And the opportunity for action is right in front of us because so many of these structural challenges can actually be addressed. They just provide more academic and cerebral answers to what are issues of passion. Right? Gridlock evokes this passion and this frustration, and we want to take out our frustration by being equally passionate. If we can channel that constructive passion into some of these structural fixes, at the end of the day, we'll have a government that we as voters are able to hold more accountable than in today's system. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
This is really helpful to hear because one of my big questions has been, what are they up to, right? So they're traveling around and they went to Politicon, but you guys have also been going to a lot of other universities, right? And so now I'm hearing there's a book project that may be happening. What other projects do you have in the works? How are you kind of organizing these thoughts and trying to pass the message forward so that we can get some mobilization around the reforms you have in mind?
You know, I think to us, the bottom line is we all are very passionate about certain issues, right? You all probably wouldn't be here if you weren't passionate about maybe immigration or healthcare, the environment, whatever it might be. And in order to get those changes that we all want, whatever side of the aisle it is, we believe that the structural changes must take place first. Because if your foundation isn't right, all these other issues really aren't going to be solved. And what you're seeing now with some major legislation like healthcare reform under President Obama or the tax reform under President Trump is very likely it being undone, right? And there were about 70 attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, right, by Republicans. And now if Democrats take over, they're going to try to repeal this tax reform. So we're saying let's find some legislation that actually has some bipartisanship and where both parties are coming together and let's fix those structural problems. So trying to get that message out there. So people, if they do want to start a ballot initiative, that's awesome, do it. California's taken some approaches on the gerrymandering and the top two system. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on that. There's some other states in Iowa and Arizona. Maine is doing the rank system. So there's some ideas out there. So we're trying to do some TV, some speaking at schools and other places to try to get that message out there.
Important context to this for where we are kind of in a moment of political history. We really are in the first decade of these voter-driven reforms on gerrymandering and primaries. These issues have always been out there. People have tried to notionally address them, but we're seeing this acceleration of solutions trying to address that problem. And very importantly, the data is still imperfect, right? In some cases, take a top two primary system in California. It's a deep blue state. How do you translate that data to, say, a purple state of Florida? We simply are unable to do that right now. Maine with ranked choice voting. We are seeing this experiment happen, right? In Florida, we're likely going to see an open primary ballot initiative in 2 years. So I would encourage you to recognize we're in this moment where there's a collective looking for solutions to this, and they're very critical solutions that really are just within reach.
Great. So I'd like to turn to money and politics now, since moderator's prerogative. So we know that survey respondents are generally turned off by large amounts of money in politics, but such an institutional concern is rarely voters' top issue, right? So they don't want big money, but really they're more concerned about immigration or healthcare or whatever. It's also quite clear that most members of Congress really dislike spending half or more of their time dialing for dollars, and David Maybe you can tell us more about your involvement in helping the public understand the extent of the pressure on legislators to fundraise. But since the public and the electeds both dislike fundraising so much, it seems like the kind of problem that members from both sides could get together to solve. Few people like the current system. A lot of people really dislike it. So why can't they get together to come up with something better, right? So maybe it's fear that the Supreme Court would strike it down under the First Amendment, or maybe there's something else going on. At my most cynical, I wonder whether it's just party leadership's favorite whip. If you don't vote our way, we'll stop transferring money to your campaign. Public funding would take away that stick for them. But maybe I'm being too cynical, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
David should go first on this. I don't know if anybody saw 60 Minutes where he sort of exposed a lot of what was really happening in the Congress.
Yeah, so if you caught the 60 Minutes piece, when I sat with the president of CBS News, I said, I will tell my story, but don't make me a whistleblower. When 60 Minutes aired, I turned to my wife and said, wow, I just became a whistleblower. Today's pathway to re-election requires an enormous amount of money. And so it is the singular focus of sitting members of Congress, without question. It drives your daily activity, your weekly activity. It drives your political priorities. It affects how you vote. Because not only do you have to be able to raise money from those willing to give to your campaign, in today's day and age, you have to rely on outside groups that will spend on your behalf based on your voting record. I was a perfect example in a very competitive special election race. It was the only race in the country because it was a special election. For those of you who may have followed the energy with the Ossoff handle race in Georgia last year, it was that type of race. All the national groups came in, and whether they liked me or not, they wanted to save the seat for Republicans. Democrats wanted to take it for their candidate. So all of these outside groups, all these special interest groups spent money on my behalf until I started voting. And then when I ran for re-election, none of them were there. And that is a reality. I often say, and it's important when we talk about structural challenges, we also get to acknowledge that it is also fair to judge the political integrity of our leaders. We need political leaders willing to lose their job for a cause that the country believes in. And this is an issue that has already perverted democracy, but the pathway we're on is one that's going to end in this way, which is this model. Because outside groups spend so much money on races, it necessarily makes the amount of money that a candidate raises and spends less and less consequential by the cycle. Right, so $14 million was spent in my race. I raised $1.4 million. Consider that amount of outside money. The Ossoff race, I think $50 million was spent. Ossoff maybe raised 4 or 5. What's going to happen is these seats become commodities of these special interest groups that under Citizens United are allowed to basically buy, sell, and trade your congressional seats. The optimism I would give you is this. When I did the 60 Minutes piece, we tried, and Tim Medeiros was on my staff, and I got to tell you, I'm grateful to the staff that stuck with me through this process. It was not easy to be a staffer for Congressman Jolly on Capitol Hill after this moment. But I'll tell you this, I took the pledge that I was no longer going to directly raise money. I stopped soliciting contributions. And at the time, I was notionally the front runner on the Republican side of the Senate primary to replace Marco Rubio. The moment I took the pledge, and this is the optimism I want to share with you, my fundraising went up. We saw a response across the country of people who said, I do care about campaign finance reform, and I want to support this guy. You only have to look as close as Texas to see what Beto O'Rourke has been able to do with his message saying, I'm not raising corporate or PAC money. And the money, he continues to set records. So I think there's an appetite there, though it doesn't rate #1 on the list. It is something that voters know is a problem and they want to see it fixed. And when they find political leaders willing to work in that direction, the support will be there for the members of Congress.
You know, that really might be an argument for doing it at the state level first, because the Supreme Court may be more hesitant to overturn something that a lot of states have done first.
So,
right?
So the bill I introduced would have prohibited directly soliciting money. We modeled it after state statutes. There are states that prohibit state legislators from raising money while they're in session. That has been upheld as constitutional. Judicial candidates who are on the ballot, at least in Florida and I think 30 other states, judicial candidates are prohibited from ever raising money in about 30 states. The U.S. Supreme Court has upheld that prohibition and said it is not an unfair restriction of political speech. Now, they said in dicta this may or may not apply to non-judicial candidates. They didn't reach that decision. But there is precedent at the state level for these types of restrictions to remove the member of Congress from the actual solicitation.
Okay, that's really interesting. How about dark money? Did dark money affect either of your campaigns? And if so, in what ways?
Yes, this is in large part what David's talking about, this outside money, whether it's a super PAC, dark money, just depending on how it's structured. There's so many loopholes in the system where you can give a $5 million check and have your name or your company on it, or you can do it so you are never known, right? There's ways to hide that. There's a lot of ways to look at campaign finance reform. As David said, it's the worst system possible. It's right up there with our healthcare system, I think. And no matter what your solution is, I would probably be for it to improve it, right? There's so many great ideas out there. One of them, I think David is in favor of transparency. A lot of people are saying, hey, just forget the limits and all that. Just have your name on it. You give money within 1 week, your name is on that check that you gave it. None of this dark money. There's a lot, I think, around that. Public financing, something that I would definitely support. I think there's some models there. There's some mixed models where there's like a matching program up to a certain amount. You get a multiplier on that. Some good ideas there. The legislation that I put forward in this space was a little bit different because what I realized is not just the amount of money. It's not just the millions and millions of dollars. It's the amount of time candidates are spending to raise that money. I went to Congress thinking my job was going to be reading legislation and committee hearings. And if you ever pan out on like a C-SPAN channel and look at a committee, there's usually like 3 or 4 people in there. You know where the 40 or 50 people that aren't there are in a call room, a little cubicle, going through a list of 5,000 sheets of paper, calling, hey, Bob, how you been? How are things in Iowa? Hey, any chance you give me $1,000? Call after call after call. And it's what I realized members of Congress are spending 50% of their time raising money in a call room, not doing their job studying issues. So my thought was, let's limit the amount of time that you can actually fundraise. Pick a number, I don't care, 8 weeks out from Election Day, 12 weeks out, go backwards, and then that's when you can start making those phone calls, or your staff can, or however that works. That way 5% of your time, you are focused on your job in that committee room, doing what you should be, studying and learning the issues. Of course, none of these things got any traction, unfortunately. But to your point, there is bipartisan support quietly on this. I would say Republicans have the advantage with the super PACs, and Democrats have traditionally been outspent for the last, 10 years. So there's been no advantage for Republicans to now come around and say, yeah, let's do this. I don't mean it's not partisan, it's just kind of the reality of it. And now with the small dollar and like the Beto O'Rourke's of the world, you might see kind of a change of the conversation where Republicans are saying, wait a minute, these small dollar activists are there. Democrats are outraising us. We got a problem. Now maybe we do need to rein this in because we both have something to lose. We'll see how that plays out. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but there's certainly backdoor chatter between Republicans and Democrats about changing campaign finance.
A very important evidentiary point. A lot of times when Patrick and I will say something and then a reporter goes to a sitting member and they say, no, that's not true. There is evidence of this outside of just the testimonials. The Huffington Post published an orientation packet for new members that the Democratic side of the aisle provided to their caucus, and it had a model daily schedule. And the model daily schedule for a new member of Congress was 4 hours a day on the phone raising money, another hour to 2 a day networking. There's 6 hours a day that the party was instructing new members, this is your first responsibility with your time as a member of Congress.
Yeah, that's one of my slides in my first day of class, my money and politics class. So let's turn the conversation to gerrymandering. We have a couple of experts in the room, so that'll be fun when we get to the Q&A. Gerrymandering is undesirable for several reasons, one of which is its effect on political polarization, which could then lead to gridlock, right? Which then leads to this tour, so there's some positives, I guess. So what solutions to gerrymandering do you think are the most promising?
So, and since we have experts in the room, I don't want to go too far down and then get whiplash back. But look, the movement around, some of you have heard fair districts, is probably the leading movement right now that says we should implement geographically compact districts. We learn as a kid in civics lessons that these squiggly lines, there's something unfair about them. The reality is the Supreme Court largely has said it's not unfair. These are political decisions as long as you're not violating certain protected classes. What I've suggested is a constructive alternative. So in Florida, we adopted fair districts. Voters worked for 6 or 8 years to have a voter-led initiative to amend our state constitution to require fairness to be defined simply by geography. I've personally suggested that in addition to geography, we should implement or suggest an electoral competitiveness test for fairness. What I mean by that is in Florida, we went to a not pure, but almost pure geography test for gerrymandering. And as a result, our delegation got more partisan, not less. It actually had the unintended effect of the 4 to 5 most moderates, myself included, Patrick, Gwen Graham, who ran for governor, lost our seats. Because in the name of fairness being geography, those districts became more polarized, not less. That's fine if we want to suggest geography should be the only test. But in terms of unrigging the system and fixing the incentives for Congress to work together, suppose if you represent a 90% district, a hyper-partisan district, the decisions you'll make in Congress when it comes to bipartisanship, you're not going to make many. Suppose you wake up every day and your district is 50-50. You're going to think every day, how do I represent a very politically diverse community? And the reward system is different. So if you took the map, we're never going to create 435 50-50 districts. There's a district outside of the Bronx, I think, that favors Democrats by about 43. There's one in Deep Red, Texas that favors Republicans by about 46. But we could get to about 75 to 80% of congressional seats being essentially toss-ups every 2 years, where all of a sudden voters have the ability to say, regardless of party, yes, I support you, or no, I don't. That would be my solution, and there are some judicial questions around injecting an electoral competitiveness test. I think they would pass muster judicially. And so I would like to see a gerrymandering reform movement that said we're going to focus on geography, and as a secondary requirement, we're going to focus on electoral competitiveness. And if we can do that, I think that would be a fundamental change to the United States Congress. We likely would not be talking about term limits ever again if we saw that type of change.
Maybe I just add a little bit of color to this, because to me, if I had to pick one issue out of the 8 that we sort of outline are the structural problems, this would probably be the single biggest one. And I never realized how bad it was till I got there. About 90% of congressional districts are predetermined, right? Out of that 435, 90% will be Republican or will be Democratic. So if you're in a safe, say, Republican seat and you're running for office, the only election that matters is the primary, right? You got to win that primary. Guess what the average turnout is in a primary in a congressional race? Right? It's like 15%. Right? So 15% of the country is determining 90% of your members of Congress. So whatever side of the aisle you're on, you want to win your seat. So how do you win? You're in the safe Republican seat, say. You know who those 15% are, right? You can tell, right, the magazines they read, the websites they go to, where they were born, how many kids they have. You put it in this fancy algorithm and spit out with pretty good certainty the issues they care about. You target those 15%, you get elected to Congress. Now you're there and you want to reach across the aisle and get something done. Well, guess what? That'll probably be used against you, because it's those same 15% that are going to be voting. So we have friends in Congress now that you all might think are a little crazy on Republican and Democratic side. Behind closed doors, they're playing a certain part, right? I was fortunate enough, in a sense, to take a trip to Afghanistan with Michelle Bachmann, if you all remember her. I probably was, before that trip, I didn't think we had anything in common. I was a little worried about this trip to Afghanistan with her, but after spending 3 or 4 days with her, I realized she was a totally different person. Right? When there are no cameras there, when there's no show to put on, she was a great person. We got along on a lot of issues. And after this whole trip, I'll tell you the whole story, but basically we had a great time. We learned a lot in Afghanistan, and there was no partisanship this whole trip. We come back, and the very first thing we do is like a little podium, little briefing to the press about the trip. And right off the bat, President Obama's the worst president in history, and the Democrats are going to kill us, and we're all going to die. And I'm like, what is happening? What do you mean? Like, we just had this great trip, not a single Republican-Democrat fight. And I realized, because the cameras were on, she had to play this role, because that's the 15%. And so all these things are tied together because the more she's on, I'm not picking on her, same for the Democrats, the more she's on Fox News, the more money she's going to raise, right? The more visible she is. So when she shows up to a new city, oh, Michelle Bach, we got to go to this fundraiser. Oh, she was just on TV. And then the more you're on TV, the more online fundraising you're going to have too, the more success you're going to have there. So it all, self-perpetuates. And then with the press component of this, that's pulling us apart. They are incentivized to show the more crazy things, right? The old saying in the press is they don't report the plane that lands on time. It's not newsworthy. So Dave and I go make a deal on infrastructure and Congress, they're not going to report on that. That's not newsworthy, right? In a sense, we're all guilty of finding the drama, right? The reality TV and all the drama. So all these things are connected together. So if you can fix one of them, the other ones, I think, start to improve as well.
Which one would you prioritize?
Gerrymandering.
Yeah, both of you?
Yeah, I'd agree with that just because campaign finance is so far out of reach because of Citizens United. Gerrymandering is within reach, although the Supreme Court, even now, said they just took a case for the first time in about 10 years, a substantive case, and said, we're gonna keep letting the states decide what they decide. And the impact of gerrymandering, though, is such that the case that went to the Supreme Court was out of Wisconsin. They termed it the efficiency gap. They were able to study the gap. I believe roughly 54% of the state voted for Democratic state legislators, but Democrats only got 46% of the seats. And so the test was, at what point is there too much gerrymandering? But even the court, and particularly now given the current majority, is still very hesitant to intervene in there. But voters at the state ballot level in a lot of states, not all states, could make those changes.
Gotcha. Great, thanks. So why don't we open it up to Q&A if you all have questions? Oh, great. Nico?
Yeah, so you seem to discuss two kinds of pressures that members of Congress feel to be partisan. One from the constituency in gerrymandered districts, so you're campaigning to the top 15% of your party, and then also the pressures from party leadership within Congress. And most of the solutions you discussed have been gerrymandered campaign finance, so things from the constituency. What kind of responses could Congress implement that would help deal with the party leadership pressure on members of Congress to be more partisan?
So the first one, the money and all that is important from a leadership standpoint. That's created some of this partisanship. But some of the ones, the structural problems that don't get that much attention that we certainly saw, was one, the lack of relationships. Right? There's a famous saying, the jet engine killed democracy. Yeah. Right? Interesting when you think about it, but all of a sudden it became really easy for members of Congress to fly home Thursday right after votes. Historically, members of Congress would move to D.C. and they were friends and they'd play golf on weekends and go to dinner together. It didn't matter you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat, who cares? We're friends. That trust is important in life and anything you do, especially when you're talking about issues that are so tough. And that's all gone now. So some of that happened in leadership in 94 with Newt Gingrich, where all of a sudden it was you were being targeted if you weren't back home campaigning, if you were there in D.C. in the Beltway and out of touch with your district. So that became a tool that leadership used. So removing that tool, forcing some of this cooperation and members to be there more. Another one is earmarks. Right, historically, Congress's role is the power of the purse. We are supposed to decide the financing and the spending of our country. Well, they had the idea in 2010 to remove earmarks, or was it earlier, a few years earlier than that. And what happened is they said, well, look, members of Congress, there's this bridge to know where they're wasting money, and it sounded good. It was an easy campaign, thing to run on. Well, what happened is then that money that was theoretically not going to be spent and would reduce the annual deficits is now being spent by the administration, some bureaucrat that's completely unelected. How does that individual know the environmental needs or the bridge that I need in St. Lucie County, Florida? How could they ever know? How could the president know the local Palm Beach issue? Well, he lives there. He might know a couple, but other than that. So members of Congress, when there were earmarks, they were able to use as a sort of the grease in the system that enabled a conversation. And it sounds dirty, but that's kind of life, that there's compromise, that you give a little and take a little, and hey, we all have a win and a loss, and I might not necessarily really want to vote for this big defense budget, but guess what? My constituents back home just got something I've been fighting for 10 years, and it's really important. And if they don't want that, then heck, vote me out if I did the wrong thing. But it helped keep things moving. And there was a little bit of power from leadership to bring people together and get those votes. So you could re-implement that. And then the third thing I'll say, and let David add, is cameras in committee rooms. Right, this one I would have said, yeah, I mean, we definitely need cameras. I want to see what these people are doing. Yeah, transparency, what are they talking about, right? Well, what it's done now is made people actors. Because every time there's a camera there, people start to put a little show on. And I've been in committee meetings where 10 members of Congress will ask Janet Yellen or whomever is there testifying the same exact question 10 times in a row. You're like, what are they doing? This is like such a waste of time. We have really important things to talk about here. Well, they want that same clip with that really tough question to be played on their local TV station or put on their website or whatever it is. And then they kind of go backstage behind the door and are like high-fiving, oh, I really got her. I really got him. Good. That was a good question. And it became like a show. So what's happened is what's going on in front of you in the TV cameras is a show for the TV, for news or their 15% back home or their donors that are going to help them out. Not necessarily real policy. So the real policy then goes behind closed doors. So it's actually been reversed in my opinion. So the cameras that are everywhere have actually made democracy worse. So all these little things that you think and I originally thought would have been better, I think hurt our process.
Your question highlights an important takeaway, I think, jurisdictionally. A lot of these reforms can actually be made by members of Congress themselves. They don't require statutory changes. So even, for instance, my proposal to enact a law, a statute, to prohibit direct solicitation of money, Congress could impose that on themselves right now as a rule. There are House rules, so you could change the schedule to 5 days a week, 3 weeks a month. You could change the rules regarding cameras. You can change campaign finance rules if Congress imposes it upon themselves. So it's important to recognize that's not out of reach jurisdictionally. And to one of my earlier comments, we get to judge the political integrity of our leaders who are deciding to ignore those types of reforms because it would interfere with their own reelection opportunities.
Hi. So I applaud all the suggestions for different things to fix to make government work better. I'm frustrated by how long it's taking. This has been going on for a long time and getting worse, as you point out. I want to ask, and I'm looking at it from external solutions, and if there was a way for Congress people to talk to each other anonymously, or they knew they were talking to other Congress people, they were confident in that, but they didn't know. But nobody else could see, as you were saying with video. Their donors couldn't see, their party leaders couldn't see, their constituents could see. I'm not changing the voting, I'm just giving you like a new kind of social media site where you could do this. Would Congress members participate? And do you think they would actually come to agreements?
Look, I think there are frank conversations now. I mean, on my fundraising bill, the Democrat who was going to be the lead sponsor called me the next day and said, I can't do it because leadership has told me I can't. I think a lot of these conversations are happening without the anonymity. People are just feel constricted by the current system, right? Patrick also often says if votes were by secret ballot, most things would get done. I would say, though, some of the solutions we're offering seem to be Herculean. They are worth the effort. And here's what I mean by that. I was originally in a 50-50 district. President Obama won it twice as a Democrat. I won it twice as a Republican. As a result of that, right, so if you were to have electorally competitive districts and open primaries, where now representatives represent this broader, more diverse community, what happened is I had license to approach as a Republican non-traditional Republican issues, right? I was able to come out very publicly in support of marriage equality. I was able to talk about campaign finance reform, about climate change, to introduce certain gun control bills. And I share that with you because had we not been redistricted, my one lament in the whole redistricting was that last election I likely would have won with about 56% of the vote. And what I wanted to do was be able to show my side of the aisle at the time, show Republicans, but show all my colleagues. There's a pathway towards re-election if you try to speak to where kind of the heartbeat of your district is, the heartbeat of your community. The problem is there's less than 25 members of Congress today that actually have that opportunity to try to speak to that type of diverse constituency. So I love the idea of an anonymous network, but I also think members are already there if we can change the incentive system that allow them to behave in the way many of them naturally would want to behave.
So I've called on two men. We have any women that want to ask a question? Yeah, Kathleen.
I have a different money politics question for you, and I'm curious what you think about it. Given the increasing amount of money spent on lobbying, and particularly now single firms make up the majority of lobbying expenditures, not even trade associations, do you feel like that is affecting, when you were a congressman, do you feel like that affected your ability to act or to solve any kinds of problems? Because you get a lot of pressure from lobbyists to not do or do particular things?
I think in the back of a member's mind, they're aware. So first of all, I would say, in large part, the idea of kind of pay to play is not there. It's the shady, here's a check, vote this way. I never saw it, and it's illegal, and if you do it, you should go to jail. I think what you're aware of, though, is, let's say there's an organization that represents airlines, right? Airlines and airports actually have very competing priorities. And so what happens is the airline lobbyist begins to cultivate a relationship with you. Most lobbyists are smarter than the member on subject matter issues. Right? You don't get elected knowing airline industry issues. And so immediately the member begins to rely on a subject matter expert. This relationship develops. And at some point in the member's mind, they're aware that, oh, if I'm voting this certain way, then there very likely or even necessarily will be financial support in the next campaign cycle. So while it's not the raw transactional pay to play, it's absolutely an influence. And you take votes on the House floor. I knew there were votes I was taking. The NRA, for instance, spent about $150,000 in support of me in my first race. I knew as soon as I started voting that money was going to be gone. And sure enough, it was. Now you have members who decide, hey, maybe I need that $150,000, so I'll just go ahead and vote this way because my constituents will overlook the fact that maybe it's out of line. The one piece I'll give you when we talk about lobbyists is this. Consider who holds the public trust in the relationship between a member of Congress and a lobbyist. It's the member of Congress. And so members of Congress can gather information wherever they want, from the constituent to Fox News to MSNBC to a paid lobbyist. The question of integrity and legality for a member of Congress is, are they allowing themselves to be unduly influenced by somebody who's supporting them financially? Lobbyists are a good punching bag. I was a former one. You better believe every one of my constituents knew that before my first election. But at the end of the day, I was an advocate for my clients, and provided I wasn't doing anything untoward, it's perfectly legal. The person who holds the public trust is the elected official. And if that elected official is allowing their decision-making to be perverted by some type of special interest or contribution, that's where we have to measure accountability at the member level more than at the lobbyist level, in my opinion.
Yep, I agree with all that, and I don't think I felt a huge difference between the trade association and the individual sort of lobby shops. At the end of the day, it's really upon the member to hear both sides of an issue, or all sides, and then kind of go above and beyond. But what happens with the money isn't just the way it influences indirectly votes typically, is that the folks with the money in these associations get more access. So they're the ones that get the meeting and get you to their office for an hour conversation with the CEO or whomever it is to then give their side. And if the other group, the other side of this issue, whatever it might be, maybe doesn't have as many financial resources, your scheduler and your chief of staff who is trying to prioritize your time to make sure you hit those numbers of 6 hours of call time and money a day aren't going to schedule that other side of the meeting because there's no money there. So then, like, we don't even sometimes, a lot of the time we have 20 meetings a day. You can't keep track of it all. But the ones without the money don't get that voice. So indirectly, all of this is corrupting.
And leaders knowingly play special interest to a tie. So take airports and airlines as an example. This is not an actual example, but just because we identified those competing interests. Leadership could spend 2 years courting each one of those industries, courting their financial contributions, knowing that the solution that gets them through the next election is just to play them to a tie and to just keep that going, because each one of those industries is going to continue to support the members or that side of the aisle so that they can continue to have the access and the audience.
So I'm going to jump in real quick because I just heard something interesting. So there's been twice now in this conversation that you've talked about money that will come in support and money that will be there or not be there the next election for you. What I didn't hear, and what I always thought was kind of a lurking unintended influence of Citizens United, is a big spending dump in opposition of you, right? And so is that just not something you worry as much about because you're so busy trying to make your numbers in terms of fundraising? You don't have time to think all the way down to like the NRA, maybe my 150,000 won't be there next time, but they might dump it into my primary opponent, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, look, you see endorsements be made in primaries where kind of establishment leadership money lanes decide to challenge a sitting member of their own side of the aisle because they're not sufficiently following their lead. I will say the reality is most of these outside groups, though they say they're nonpartisan, they absolutely align with one side of the aisle or the other, and they are in direct coordination with party leadership on either side of the aisle, either legally or illegally. Perfect example. After the Pulse nightclub, I introduced a gun reform bill that lost me all the support of my side of the aisle and certainly all the financial support of the gun lobby. The campaign on the other side for more gun control decided to spend $50,000 to try to beat me because they simply were an arm of the Democratic majority that was trying to unseat the Republican. Similarly, I had objectively very high environmental ratings, but the League of Conservation Voters or something in the final race spent $100,000 against me because these are all coordinated arms of one side of the aisle or the other. They simply are. And they're playing for majority. Yeah, they're playing for majority.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. So you pretty much know, like as a Democrat, I knew the NRA would never support me on it, whatever they're going to spend $100,000 or $1 million against me. Like I know it's coming. It is what it is. I can't control that. For these groups, they want to show wins, right? They want to be able to show their supporters 90% of the seats we played in, we won. We're good at picking winners here. So that's why, in a sense, it doesn't matter. If all of a sudden my district, they think they can beat me, there's money from all over the place, and I'm never going to control, no matter my voting record. I could be 100% with them, and they're still going to, because they want that win in my seat. Now, if I have a 10-point lead and they don't have a chance, they're not going to mess with me. So that's really what it comes down to, is that win-loss and that majority.
First, I want to thank you both for being here. I learned so much already. And Congressman Jolly, I love you on the 11th hour. You are terrific.
It's the 8th hour on the West Coast.
Yes, I'm watching you become, which is fantastic. So that kind of leads into my question about the role of the media and the press shedding a spotlight on these systemic issues and kind of letting us know when there are these bipartisan efforts going on. And do you think that's happening? What can be done to make that better? And if I can throw in an unrelated thing, term limits, if you want to speak to that.
Very quickly on term limits. Term limits ultimately is about a voting public trying to get greater accountability, right? We feel like members of Congress have lost touch. Personally, I would rather see the reforms we've talked about to create more electoral competitiveness, because I think you would see the natural turnover accelerate dramatically in the United States Congress. The turnover is already pretty high in Congress. We just picture the people that have been there for 30 or 40 years, but ultimately, to establish more accountability, I would prefer gerrymandering reform and opening primaries compared to term limits.
Media piece, yeah. So I pretty much agree. Term limits, it's interesting in politics. Basically, if I have to go to the doctor, I want to go to the doctor that's done it for a long time, has a lot of experience. If I need my car fixed, I want a mechanic with a lot of experience, whatever it is. But in politics, it's like we don't want anybody with experience. We want the new person, like get someone fresh and new. And I get where all that's coming from. But I've also seen it in D.C. where the members don't have any expertise on an issue. And so who influences them? It's often lobbyists or their staff, neither of which is accountable to any of us. And so, gosh, my staff's been here 20 years in DC, and they know this issue really well. I guess I'll do that. You can't be an expert on every issue, right? You deal with 30 issues a day. So having some of that expertise is actually good in my opinion. I went to Congress thinking, yeah, 8 years, get the heck out of there. You're done. But now I've seen how actually having some of that expertise would be helpful. Now maybe there's a middle ground in the teens or something. With the press, this is a huge problem. David and I had a panel on this yesterday at Politicon. And this is probably the hardest one to me to solve. I love everyone's ideas on this one. But you think back 30 years ago with, you'd have a couple news stations. You'd have Walter Cronkite telling you what happened. And it was ABC or CBS or NBC. You got basically the same set of facts. There wasn't as much opinion. It was just, here's what happened. You go to bed, you make up your own sort of opinion on it. Same thing in the newspapers, generally, kind of preaching from the same fact book. And fast forward to today, where a lot of us get our political news is either the Fox or CNN or MSNBC, which don't talk for sure on the same facts, right? Like different planets, and are giving a lot of opinion now because that's what we all kind of crave, is that opinion piece. Same thing with the newspapers. And take it another step, you look at what's happening online, where typically it's human nature, and one of the experts yesterday sort of talked about the science behind this, with our brain, where we want to confirm our own biases. We want to, see that constant confirmation, and it's agitating. It doesn't work well in our brain when we see things that we don't agree with constantly. So for me, I don't go to foxnews.com, right? It just pisses me off. I don't like to go. So I'm guilty of becoming more rigid in my beliefs because I watch MSNBC at night. I watch David every night. I can't wait to see him. Yeah, biggest fan. And then I wake up and read my certain websites that are more liberal leaning. And then guess what? My social media circle, my Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all that, is by and large my group of friends that I communicate with, that have similar education and same background and interests, and probably politically pretty much the same. So we get in this echo chamber. Gosh, we're so right. And then what are you talking about? Like, you haven't even heard the other side of the view. So this media one keeps getting worse and worse and easier for us to become more rigid in our beliefs, but also easier to be targeted, right? And that's the other piece of this, is how it's not like accidental, the targeting and the news that we're getting from Facebook, right? We've seen all this, and it's getting worse and worse as these algorithms get better and better. So that's a really tough one to change. And I don't know what the answer is.
So I actually have a dose of optimism, and it's based on the foundation that the voices we hear are the voices right now that win, right? The reason we hear some of these extreme voices is because that's what the system is producing. So in the long lens, if we're able to, as voters, as citizens, to address some of these structural issues and begin to unrig the system, we'll see a different group of winners emerge that do become newsworthy. I also think we're in a generational moment, and this is where short term I'm very optimistic. After November, sometime in the next 6 to 8 months, we're going to see a national conversation about either a third party or independent lane. We're going to see a leader emerge that talks about a third party run for president, like we saw with Ross Perot. That will eat up a lot of the news energy. Patrick and I considered running on a unity ticket. He is a Democrat, me as a Republican, not as independents. And the moment we started talking about a unity ticket, it was newsworthy. People were interested. So I think in the next year we'll see more attention to that space.
That was for governor of Florida, or you're thinking about it for president?
For governor of Florida.
I was like, are we breaking news? Are we breaking news at the panel?
Not breaking news.
So how do we increase voter turnout? Because I think that 15% on either side of the polar ends of the spectrum is what's driving the politics now. And I think we all lament the idea that you've got this middle. I consider myself a moderate Democrat, that said earlier something about why I used to be a moderate Republican. We don't have a voice in many ways, and yet there was a point in my past where I used to believe there was a role for those partisans on either side to bring ideas to the table and reach compromise. We don't see the compromise anymore because we've got that low voter turnout, gerrymandering, all the stuff we talked about. How do we solve the public engagement side of it and get more people involved, perhaps educated? There used to be ways to discriminate against blacks, particularly in the South, with literacy tests. There's a part of me that says, well, maybe we ought to have an intelligence test that allows people to vote. Because we have people that are being influenced by social media, which is manipulated, some believe by the Russians. You know, I don't even have to be Russian to manipulate the system. It's just too easy now. Because we are in these social media silos that just precipitate this sort of self-confirmation that people seem to enjoy.
So there are the obvious ones with reducing the voter suppression and the structural problems we've outlined have incentivized more of this extreme behavior, and then the moderates say, I'm not going to vote. And in a lot of states, like independents can't vote in Florida. That's about 1/3 of the voters can't even vote in the primary. So then when it comes election day and they're saying, oh, I don't know, I didn't vote for either one of these people, I'm not going to show up. So all these factors have a piece. I'm generally an optimist, but on this one, I'll take it a little bit higher level, and I'm unfortunately pessimistic on it because when you look globally, we're seeing more of this extremism play out, the authoritarian and the populist movement, and we're seeing it in Brazil right now. We just saw it in Sweden a couple of weeks ago, and in Germany, and Brexit. Duterte in the Philippines, right? This sort of strong man and these strong ideologies are playing out. So America isn't unique in this, and in hindsight, President Trump really is an anomaly. He fits kind of the norm. It's almost expected that he won, really. And I think there's a lot of factors for that. I'm not smart to figure out why. I think maybe one of the biggest reasons of that is this income inequality we're seeing play out across the globe, but for sure in our own country. And a lot of factors to that. So until that gets fixed, I think we're going to see more of this extremism. And as technology gets more and more advanced, and we see more artificial intelligence and the sharing economy and AI and all these things play out, automation, I think this is going to get worse, unfortunately, because I think there's going to be more and more displacement and fewer needs for humans in many ways. And if you're not addressing education at the same time that this is happening, then there's going to be more displacement. And I think you play that into what Donald Trump identified as an immigration problem, right? The first thing he said was build a wall, is sort of the shallow piece of that, oh, it's someone's taking my job. And so whether it's the Syrians in Europe or the Mexicans in Donald Trump's mind here in this country, that was an easy tool. That's only going to get worse, in my opinion, with climate change. And as more and more people are seeing more of the world because of internet and access to it, more people want to travel now and have those opportunities. So you see more of this immigration could lead to more hatred and more of this sort of isolation. And we're living in the middle of a technological revolution, right? I think it's hard for us to see it because we're so close to this right now. But to me, this is like the industrial revolution, right? That unfortunately led to some really bad things. And I think we're living in the middle of that right now. And I don't know how we come out of that right away, but I unfortunately fear this hatred we're seeing play out in our country and the world is going to get worse because of that.
I took a little bit of a political journey on this. I came of age thinking that having certain steps to registration are important, right? That it's a right, it's a privilege, but it should require some level of effort. I've kind of taken a political journey now to where, and part of it was representing a community where voter turnout wasn't very high in certain parts of the county. Today, I think voting should be as easy and accessible as it can be secure, because I think every voice should have the same parity regardless of walk of life. And my concern as a recently now former Republican is we know that in the last 7 presidential elections, Republicans have only won the popular vote one time. And what I see from within the party is instead of addressing that political and cultural demographic that is getting away from Republicans, Republicans have decided to try to put additional restrictions in place through all these systems we're talking about to try to hold ground, if you will. I would much rather see both parties try to address where we're going as a country and figure out how to be leaders in that movement, not laggards.
So this has come up a couple times briefly, little flags in the conversation. So Congressman Jolly recently resigned his membership in the Republican Party and has become an independent. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that decision. I understand it was quite personal in some ways, but also strategically what that means for your political future, and especially in Florida, right? So where they don't have open primaries.
In terms of ballot access, it's probably the dumbest decision a candidate can make. Look, so immediately now, challenges to ballot access for me as an independent and access to an institutional donor base simply isn't there. So if you're a political consultant advising a candidate, I just did everything wrong. in that process. I do believe, though, that there in the very near term is going to be an energetic movement towards what does a third lane look like. And so I intend to be a part of that. What I did not anticipate was, I left the party because from the day Donald Trump walked into the party, I said, I can't embrace this guy as the leader of the party or the country. I did that as a sitting House member. I've stayed on that message. I know other Republicans have had different journeys to deciding to support him or not. I have a piece coming out likely tomorrow on NBC that declares you can't be never Trump and a Republican. People will disagree or agree with me, but that's where I got to. I got to the point where I realized so much of my concern right now is not just about the president's decisions, but it's what the party is deciding to do as well. And at the end of the day, I didn't feel like I had a voice or a home in that coalition of voters within the Republican Party. I'm excited about where we are in this moment in time to be an independent. I really am. But the reality is, as a candidate, it gets much trickier if I were to ever decide to run again. I don't come from means. I can't self-finance. In Florida, party access, or ballot access, is going to be much more difficult for me should I decide to run.
Gotcha. We have time for one more question. Pam, you want it?
I don't know. This will be the last question. So it seems to me like you've done a really nice. First, thank you all three of you. This has been a lot of fun to listen to, and you've done a really nice job of outlining the structural problems and the incentives that are in place for a number of the concerns that we have with respect to gridlock and teamsmanship and all those sorts of things, as well as you covered lots of different things. And you've also talked about priorities and a little bit about what solutions might, but what we haven't heard is how do you get to those solutions, given the structural problems, given the incentives that are in play. It seems to me like it's like, oh yes, these things, and now here's how we solve it. Worrying about district boundaries, all these different things. How do you get there?
If I could, I'll take it very quickly. As voters, we quickly identify November elections with candidates, right? We think about political campaigns as being about candidates. If you leave here thinking about one other thing, consider the fact that ballot initiatives are equally as important and equally on par with the candidacy of a specific person. And our ability to mobilize behind that cause, to get that on a ballot, to perhaps contribute to it either through our time or our resources, though it is, again, an academic answer to a passionate frustration, the reality is, and Florida's a perfect example. I'm committed to getting an open primary ballot initiative over the finish line in 2020 in the state of Florida because I think that is more important than any candidate I'll have the opportunity to work for in the state of Florida going into 2020. So if you find yourself responding to, I'd like to see gerrymandering reform, I'd like to see primary reform, or maybe at the state level, I'd like to see campaign finance reform, there are vehicles right now to change laws in state capitals that actually would allow us to make some of these changes.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think a lot of people that are frustrated, to your point, that are leading these ballot initiatives. There's one for restoring felons' rights, for example, in Florida. There's some really good amendments right now that are being led by voters saying the politicians don't have the courage to do this anymore. Forget them, we're done. We're gonna go get X amount of signatures, 800 or so thousand, I think, in Florida, to get on the ballot. We're gonna get the right language and we're gonna get this passed. And these are citizen-led. So, we always make the point, whatever your topic is that you care most about, if it's a specific issue, there's probably a group out there that's pretty well aligned that you might want to get involved with. And to your point, sir, I think the younger generation, unfortunately, because of the tragedies we've seen in schools and the shootings, are activated. And we don't know how this is going to play out and what's going to happen now if that energy's lost. But there might have been certain moments there along the last couple of years that got a whole new generation, interested in politics. We've been doing this tour for about a year now, and quite a few universities that we've been at have had high school students show up, right? That whether they can vote or almost vote or not, but they're there and they've got their group of people back home and they're really excited about getting involved, learning. So hopefully they will be starting some new movements as well for the issues that they care about. And then the politicians are going to respond to that because they're going to say, oh, wait a minute, that just passed in my state. I think I'm going to change my mind. 70% of the votes went there. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit on this issue.
A great example on voter right restoration for felons in Florida. that has taken on such a movement and will likely pass that the Republican Party of Florida, who previously had been opposed to it, has decided to stay silent. And they're not taking a position because they see the political movement among voters moving in that direction. And
another point that we didn't get to is politicians, sometimes people think that they're leaders, and sometimes they are. They're typically followers. Right? They're going to follow the mood of their district or state or whatever it might be. So when citizens, when voters are taking the initiative to lead something, and just like for David and I, if someone came to our office and said, hey, I've got me and this person here, two of us we really care about this issue and we're going to hold you accountable. Okay, that's good. But if like 5,000 people showed up and said, hey, we're going to hold you accountable, we're watching you, that means something, right? Because then there's a base and a following there. And with social media, I think it's easier to get these kind of groups together and to find people that align with you. So, I think we always try to encourage people, like, don't be shy about meeting your representatives and whomever, and get that group of people behind you, because it really does weigh in the politician's head.
How about the calls? A lot of people make calls to their members of Congress. You pay attention to that? You just tally them up?
I get a briefing every 2 weeks in my office of all the phone calls, the emails, the letters that we got, and 2,000, I think we got about 2,000 calls a week and a certain amount of letters and emails, and would do like a little pie chart on what the issues were. It typically followed the news cycle, right, as you'd expect, but that was important to me to see kind of where my district was and the issues being discussed. And all of a sudden, wow, 80% of the people calling are on the environment in my district. We're going to focus on that. That's the issue.
But when they're unified and holding you accountable together, that's where it has bite. Yeah. Sure. Last one.
Are there people in the parties that are unelected that have undue influence on all of this? You talk about how the party says we're going this way and that happens. It just sounds like, it's starting to sound like there's a few people in the parties with a lot of power, and I'm wondering if they're elected or unelected. It's
the outside groups, without question. If you're in leadership, that means you decide the legislative agenda for the year. Why did we not have a bill passed that says if you're on the terror watch list, you can't buy a gun? Right? 92% of the country supported it. The reason is because of the influence of gun lobby money. Why is it that there's such a push to repeal the Affordable Care Act, despite the fact it polls very high? It's because the Chamber of Commerce and other groups want to see the repeal. And so the outside groups are moving the puppet a lot. I would say, though, it is balanced by voters, though at times it doesn't seem like it. The reason the Senate did not vote to repeal Obamacare a year ago was because the voters didn't want them to. The reason John McCain voted no, the reason there wasn't enough votes, was because voters didn't want them to. If voters wanted them to repeal it, it would have been repealed with 70% of the vote. So the greatest influence is, without question, in terms of decision-making in the halls of Congress, is those outside groups. But it quickly comes up against where the heartbeat of the country is if legislators are actually listening.
Okay, so we'll leave it there. So as we wind down, we want to recognize the sponsors. Here's a lot of names. You ready? The Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and the John and Judith Bedrosian Center on Governance at USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. It's with their generosity that we've been able to have this discussion today. Really want to thank David and Patrick for joining us, sharing their experiences and crystallizing the areas in which reform-oriented citizens can take action. In case you want to follow up, their website for the initiative is letsfixwashington.com. So thank you all for taking time out of your morning.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.